Okay, I wanted to do this one about wind farms and some of their consequences because the left always loves to talk about wind farms, but they're really not a good thing at all. Like there's almost no real value to these things. So let's talk about offshore wind farming. And this is done by Edward Ring via the American Greatness. As usual, we're using Zero Hedge's clean interface. All right, so when it comes to renewables wreaking havoc on the environment, wind turbines have stiff competition. For example, over 500,000 square miles of biofuel plantations have already replaced farms and forests to replace a mere 4% of transportation fuel. Think about that. 500,000 square miles. 500,000 square miles of biofuel plantations. Removing forests to do this, to take care of 4% of transportation fuel. Pathetic. Hemp oil, by the way, which grows almost everywhere and can be grown indoors extremely efficiently, is thousands of times better than the stuff that they're growing. Literally. Like the hemp oil, as far as biomass yield, it's a factor of 4 better than its nearest competitor, which is sugarcane, which we don't even use. We use soybean oil and corn, which in terms of hemp oil's production, it is literally like 1,000 times better than corn. Okay, so to source raw material and build sustainable batteries, mining operations are scaling up with no end in sight in nations with appalling labor conditions and non-existent environmental regulations. But the worst offender is the wind industry. And that's another thing, too. You know, no one's talking about the battery and all the rare earth minerals, all the cobalt that has to be mined by little kids in foreign countries that you don't care about. America's wind power industry somehow manages to attract almost no negative coverage in the press or litigation from environmentalists, despite causing some of the most obnoxious and tragic environmental catastrophes so far this century. Last August, I wrote about the ongoing slaughter of whales off America's northeast coast thanks to construction of offshore wind turbines. They also kill birds en masse. I don't know if he's going to talk about that, but literally millions upon millions of birds die every year because of all of those wind turbines. When you detonate massive explosives, repeatedly drive steel piles into the ocean floor with a hydraulic hammer, and blast high decibel sonar mapping signals underwater, you're going to harm animals that rely on sound to orientate themselves in the ocean. To say it is a mere coincidence that hundreds of these creatures have washed ashore dead all of a sudden during precisely the same months when blasting and pounding began is a brazen deception. Nonetheless, when the story can't be buried, deception is the strategy. Not one major environmental organization, government watchdog agency, or media outlet has called for a slowdown in industrial offshore wind projects. Instead, they repeatedly claim these allegations are misinformation. And from that paragraph of truthfactcheck.org, we get this, quote, no evidence offshore wind development killing whales. Yeah. What a joke. Let's set aside the obvious negative impact on whale populations and tens of thousands of marine surveying and construction sorties into offshore areas where shipping traffic hasn't ever been concentrated, or the impact of noises and explosions on not one site, such as would be the case with a lone oil rig, but thousands of sites, each one being prepared for offshore wind turbines. The destruction wrought by wind turbines extends well beyond what it's doing to the whales. A report just released by New England Fishermen Association summarizes research they completed on offshore wind projects. Their findings are stunning. Just the geographic extent of these proposed offshore wind projects is unprecedented. According to the report, federal regulators at the Bureau of Ocean Management have designated almost 10 million acres for wind farm surveys and development. That is over 15,000 square miles. Not included in that allocation are the corridors where high voltage lines will have to cross the ocean floor to transfer electricity from the turbines to land-based power grids. The report found that electromagnetic fields emanating from subsea cables appear to produce birth deformities in juvenile lobster. That's just the beginning. And of course it does. I mean, electromagnetic pulse or EMF waves, they cause damage. That's why we keep our power away from the houses and things like that. We learned that after the 50s, where we put them right next to and over people's houses. And then that's where the whole "did you live under power lines" comes from. It's bad to be around power lines. You want to be a distance from them. The report also found that wind farms increase sea surface temperatures and alter upper ocean hydrodynamics in ways scientists do not yet understand, and whip up sea sediment and generally high turbid turbid wakes that are 30 to 150 meters wide and several kilometers in length, having a major impact on primary production by phytoplankton, which are the base of marine food chains, and bring oxygen. Something that is not talked about is that plankton and algae produce the majority of the oxygen on this planet. It's not trees, it's not the Amazon, it's algae and plankton. Wind turbines generate operational noise in low frequency range, less than 700 hertz, with most energy concentrated between 2 and 200 hertz. This frequency range overlaps with that used by fish for communication, mating, spawning, and spatial movement. And high voltage direct current undersea cables produce magnetic fields that negatively affect the drifting trajectory of haddock larvae by interfering with their magnetic orientation capabilities. Haddock are a significant portion of U.S. commercial fish landings and are an important component of the marine food chain. Nothing to see here, right? What's going on off the coast of New England is being allowed to happen because of disgraceful negligence on the part of America's environmentalist community. What's about to happen in California is just as bad and is proceeding without any organized opposition or serious criticism. Earlier this year, the federal government leased 583 square miles of deep ocean waters off the coast of California for offshore wind farms. When the first phase of these offshore wind developments are completed, these wind farms will deliver 4.5 gigawatts of, quote, clean energy to the California grid. That may sound like a lot of electricity. It's not. To begin with, even offshore wind only blows intermittently. The most optimistic projections for the actual yield of these turbines is not more than 50%. This means that in terms of baseload power, only 2.25 gigawatts will come from these new offshore wind farms. California's average electricity consumption is 32 gigawatts, of which 22 gigawatts are produced in state, which means that if these offshore wind farms are ever completed, they'll supply a mere 6% of California's current electricity demand, the same amount currently coming from Diablo Canyon, California's last operating nuclear power plant. But how many turbines will this take, and what will they look like? Right. So you're going to have all of this damage in the ocean. You're going to kill all kinds of marine life, all to produce 6%, which one nuclear reactor could do. The biggest wind turbines in the world can now produce 10 megawatts of at full output to generate this much electricity. These machines are 1,000 feet tall, which is more than 3 times higher than the Statue of Liberty from the waterline to the tip of the torch. To achieve a collective capacity at full output of 4.5 gigawatts, 450 of these would have to be built, floated 20 miles offshore, anchored to the seabed with cables nearly a mile long. Then from each one, a high voltage line would also have to descend 4,000 feet to reach the ocean floor, where it would then lie on the seabed. Some proposals actually call for them to be buried to transmit electricity to the onshore power grid. 450 floating wind turbines, each one of them with vertical dimensions that are longer than a modern aircraft supercarrier. These are huge and unresolved engineering hurdles involved in developing large floating wind turbines. Bear in mind, if California state legislature gets its way, the state will go fully electric. Think all space heaters, water heaters, dryers, along with all trucks, buses, and cars going fully electric. Electricity demand will more than triple. While it's hypothetical, the math is simple and revealing. To get 100 gigawatts of baseload power from offshore wind, you would need 20,000 turbines. And imagine all the high voltage distribution lines and all the batteries to buffer the massive surges of intermittent power. And that is a really rosy scenario too, because that's not realistic. You'd actually need 40,000 turbines, because at best they're going to get 50%. And you'd also have to have massive battery farms, which what happens when they fail? And they do eventually. No battery lasts forever. And then you have to dispose of them, which is extremely toxic. To return to reality, we must acknowledge that none of California's enlightened planners intend to use offshore wind to generate 100% of California's renewable electricity. But in one of the most reputable mainstream studies produced to date, a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford University, Mark Jacobson, completed a series of simulations culminating in a report released in December 2021 that called for 20% of California's electricity derived from offshore wind. Making more conservative assumptions regarding the size of each offshore turbine and the yield, he predicted more than 12,000 offshore wind turbines would be required. 12,000. Imagine producing 12,000 of those to pollute the sea. Imagine the logistics. How many ships will this take? How many submarines and divers? How many port facilities? How many new homes for the construction workers? What about all the undersea cables? What about the storage batteries needed to buffer nearly 20 gigawatts of on-again, off-again electricity? What about the ongoing maintenance? What about the raw materials needed to build all these Leviathans? What about the billions and billions of dollars that will flow into the pockets of special interests behind the disaster of a project paid by taxpayers and ratepayers? Overall, Jacobson's study projected about 1/3 of California's electricity to come from a combination of onshore and offshore wind turbines. Shall we reiterate what else we already know about wind turbines? Their slaughter of raptors, bats, and insects, their incessant low-frequency sound that is audible for miles, and despite debunking articles that defy basic common sense, drives people and animal nuts, the visual blight, the staggering quantity of materials required for their manufacture, and the difficult, if not impossible, task of recycling materials after they've reached the end of their service life, which they don't. There's a giant, huge graveyard in Ohio that's getting bigger and bigger of materials that cannot be recycled, that have to go into a landfill, and they're from the wind turbines. Those blades cannot be recycled, and they do not have a long life. In Kansas, there's a stretch in I-70 when you're driving down in western Kansas. We have all these wind turbines. It's just the most awful thing to drive through because you have all these turbines everywhere the eye can see. If you go through it at night, because each one of them has a red light on top of it to prevent them from being hit by planes, you just have this sea of blinking red lights, and it's so difficult to drive through. It's incredibly distracting, and the wind turbines themselves are distracting. You have a bunch of spinning things, which that's something that your mind is designed to do. Like, the human eye is trained to look at motion, and so when you see a whole bunch of wind turbines spinning, like you're compelled to look at them. It causes distractions. The amount of accidents in that stretch of I-70 has increased by like eight times or something like that. I forget. I was talking to a highway patrolman once, and he's like, yeah, we see so many more accidents. And it's because people they get distracted by the wind turbines. They hit, they go off the road. They hit someone else. Most of them are minor, but it doesn't matter. And all for nothing, because most of the wind turbines, they don't even deliver a lot of useful energy. Our energy company that supplies the power in Kansas is called Evergy, and they just keep having to fire up the coal plants to meet the demand because the wind turbines can't do it. And our costs for electricity keep going up. We pay more now than we've ever paid. And coal burns clean. I mean, you can capture all of the emissions from coal. It's not hard. We have coal power plants that have zero emissions. All right, where are the environmentalists? Where, for that matter, are the economists in the mantra climate crisis? Is the mantra climate crisis so powerful that literally anything goes, including a scheme that delivers not only environmental, but economic catastrophe? In 2020, an in-depth financial analysis by the Manhattan Institute documented how offshore wind's cost far exceed its benefits. And that was before the supply chain problems, inflation, and interest rate hikes that have forced offshore wind developers from New England to California to greatly increase required rates or pull the projects altogether. Imagine if this was an oil rig, a desalination plant, or a nuclear power plant. The opposition would be apoplectic, and that is not just a hypothetical conjecture. California had a chance to build another major desalination plant, which would have supplied 55,000 feet per year of drought-proof fresh water to the residents of Orange County, population 3 million. Along with other projects in the works, this desalination plant could have made that relatively arid coastal country completely independent of imported water, but environmentalists fought the project at every turn, and in May of 2022, in a unanimous vote, the California Coastal Commission denied the construction permit. Imagine denying a desalination plant for people under drought. That's what they do in California. As for oil and gas, California state legislature doing everything they can to destroy production in the state. Despite having massive reserves of oil and gas, California's had to import more than 75% of their oil and more than 90% of their natural gas. And when it comes to nuclear power, the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, California's last one, narrowly escaped regulatory shutdown every few years, and despite being designated to operate well past the middle of its century, and despite being designed to operate well past the middle of this century. The scandalous double standard at work here can only be attributed to a combination of powerful special interests that represent the wind power industry interacting with the state legislature and environmentalist movement that is either bought off or alarmingly dumb. As it is, hundreds of billions of taxpayer subsidies are on track to pay for offshore wind. If it is not stopped, it will be one of the most egregious cases of economic waste and environmental destruction in human history. Until next year, in which case they'll find something worse to do. It's utterly amazing what some of these leftists will do. Nuclear power is clean. It's relatively easy to do, and we have much better methods. Like the original nuclear power plants, you can complain about them to a certain extent because all they did is just take the same nuclear generators from nuclear submarines and scale them up, which was not the most efficient way. Like nuclear power plants for submarines were designed to operate in small, confined spaces, whereas, in a large area, we could do a whole lot better. And with the prospect of fusion power plants, there's also cold fusion, and Bill Gates even promoted a project that could take older nuclear material and get every little last drop out of that and produce a lot of effective energy from some of our waste. So like we would even have a solution to some of our nuclear waste. And of course, hemp oil solves all of these problems. Hemp can be grown virtually everywhere in this country. It can be grown most efficiently indoors. It produces oil that is much more efficient than petroleum for diesel engines. It's not as efficient for combustion, but since it's renewable and easy to do, it would be a lot cheaper than gas. So even though you get less fuel economy, it would cost half or less of what the gas does. So I mean, if you had $1.25 per gallon fuel, you wouldn't care that you get less fuel economy. And it gets better fuel economy in a diesel engine. It's better than in a diesel engine. So we could switch to diesel, and that would make a huge impact on like the trucking industry because that's all diesel powered stuff. So if we could have better, cheaper diesel fuel, that would make prices go down across the board. It would benefit everyone. But of course, we don't want to do that because what we care about is taking as much as we can and creating as much scarcity as possible, because that is what makes the most money. And the environmentalists are bought off by the same companies that benefit from this stuff. So for all of you environmentalists out there, we have answers: nuclear and hemp, not wind. Wind isn't an answer. It's making things worse.